with Americanized names and locations. Flavor and Flair was not just another restaurant in the bustling downtown of Chicago. For Rachel Sanders, it was her own little kingdom, where her word was law and her mood dictated the climate of the day. At 35, she reigned supreme among the tables of the traditional establishment, not for the quality of her service, but for the fear she inspired in customers and co-workers alike. On that Monday morning, the sun had barely risen when Rachel strode through the restaurant doors, her high heels echoing across the still empty wooden floor. Her impeccable uniform and perfect bun contrasted with the sour expression she wore on her face. "Good morning, Rachel," Paula, the kitchen assistant, timidly murmured while organizing ingredients for the day. Rachel responded with a careless nod, too busy checking her perfectly painted nails to waste words on subordinates. Her kingdom was beginning to awaken. Waiters were setting tables, cooks were preparing the first dishes of the day, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. "Rachel, we need to talk about last week's complaints," Edward, the manager, approached, with a clipboard in hand. At 45, he tried to maintain order in the establishment, but always ran into the difficult personality of his longest-serving employee. "What complaints, Edward? That lady who couldn't read the menu and still wanted special treatment, or the couple who thought they could modify every dish on the menu?" Rachel rolled her eyes, brusquely adjusting the cutlery on a table. "Rachel, you know our customers are the lifeblood of the business. Mr. Martinez wasn't at all satisfied with last month's report. The online reviews." "Mr. Martinez barely shows up here," Rachel interrupted. "I've been at this restaurant for 15 years. I know every table, every regular customer, every irritating quirk they have. If they don't like my way, they can find somewhere else to eat." The manager sighed, once again defeated by the wall of arrogance Rachel had built around herself. It was true that she knew the restaurant like no one else. Every corner, every routine, every secret. Her efficiency was undeniable, but her attitude drove customers away and created a toxic environment among the staff. "Rachel, I'm just asking for a little more." Edward tried once more, but was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A woman of about 50 entered the restaurant. Her hesitant steps and corpulent figure immediately drew Rachel's critical gaze. The newcomer wore elegant but discreet clothes and carried a designer handbag that Rachel recognized as authentic. "Good morning," the woman said in a soft voice, approaching the counter where Rachel stood. "Are you serving yet?" Rachel examined the customer from head to toe, not hiding her displeasure. "It's 7:30 in the morning. Breakfast starts at 8 a.m., as is clearly written on the door," she replied, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "Oh, I'm sorry. Can I wait? I have an important meeting later and—" "That's up to you," Rachel cut her off, turning her back to organize napkins that were already perfectly arranged. The woman sat down quietly at one of the tables, taking a tablet from her bag and starting to read something. Rachel, from her post, began a whispered comment with Melissa, another waitress. "Did you see that? The things I have to deal with. I bet she'll want the entire diet menu and then complain it's tasteless." Melissa laughed nervously, torn between fear of Rachel and embarrassment over the situation. The customer, though seemingly concentrated on her reading, had tense shoulders, indicating she could probably hear every word. The clock struck 8 a.m. and the restaurant began to receive its first customers of the day. Rachel moved between the tables with the grace of a dancer and the sharp tongue of a serpent. For regular customers who already knew her temperament, she offered efficient service and even a restrained smile. For newcomers, especially those who dared to make special requests or complain, she reserved her arsenal of veiled insults and cutting glances. The woman at the first table finally placed her order, a full breakfast, complete with fruits, breads, and eggs. Rachel noted it all down with a barely disguised expression of disdain. "Are you sure you want all that? Our breakfast is quite hearty, you know," she commented, leaving a malicious insinuation about the customer's weight hanging in the air. The woman raised her eyes from the tablet for the first time, looking at Rachel with a serene expression that, for some reason, made the waitress feel uncomfortable. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied simply, her calm voice carrying a note of authority that Rachel couldn't quite identify. While preparing the order, Rachel continued her malicious comments in the kitchen, eliciting nervous laughter from younger staff members and disapproving looks from the more experienced ones. Edward, from his corner, observed everything with growing concern. The customer ate her meal slowly, savoring each bite with a tranquility that deeply irritated Rachel. When she finished, she asked for the bill with the same calmness she had maintained throughout her stay. As she stood up to leave, the woman paused for a moment, looking directly at Rachel. Her eyes, previously serene, now sparkled with something different. Perhaps determination, perhaps knowledge of something to come. "Thank you for the service," she said, her voice low but clear. "We'll see each other again soon." Rachel frowned, confused by those enigmatic words, but soon shrugged, returning to her routine of commanding her little kingdom with an iron fist. Little did she know that this seemingly ordinary morning would mark the beginning of a transformation that would shake all the foundations of her carefully constructed world. The next morning, flavor and flair dawned different. Even before Rachel arrived, an unusual commotion stirred the restaurant. Men in suits circulated through the dining room, carrying folders and documents, talking in low but urgent tones. "What's going on here?" Rachel asked as soon as she crossed the doorway, her usual tone of authority slightly shaken by the unusual scene. Edward, who seemed even more nervous than usual, quickly approached. His face was pale, and beads of sweat shone on his forehead. "Rachel, I'm glad you're here. We have an extraordinary meeting in 15 minutes. All employees must attend," he explained, nervously consulting his watch. "Meeting? This early? Edward, you know we have to prepare everything for—" "The doors will not open to the public this morning," interrupted a familiar voice. Rachel turned, surprised both by the interruption and by recognizing the voice. It was the woman from the day before. But now she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a group of executives and, more impressively, wore an elegant ensemble that exuded authority. "Mrs. Olsen," Edward respectfully greeted. "Everyone is already arriving for the meeting." Rachel remained motionless, her brain trying to process the transformation before her eyes. The customer she had belittled the day before now commanded the situation with a presence that made everyone around her seem small. "Please, everyone to the conference room," announced Mrs. Olsen, her calm but firm voice echoing through the environment. The employees headed to the room at the back of the restaurant, normally used only for occasional training. Rachel automatically followed the group, her usual haughty posture visibly shaken. "As you all should know, Flavor and Flair has gone through financial difficulties in recent months," Mrs. Olsen began once everyone was settled. "What you don't know is that the establishment has been sold. From today on, I am the new owner." A murmur ran through the room. Rachel felt her stomach sink. Her hands, normally steady, began to tremble slightly. "My name is Helen Olsen," she continued, "and I have significant plans for this place. Changes will be necessary, and I hope to count on everyone's commitment." Her eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on Rachel, who for the first time in years felt the weight of being observed and judged. "Some of you have worked here for a long time," Helen went on, her gaze still fixed on Rachel. "You know our history, our tradition, but tradition without evolution is stagnation. We need to change." Edward timidly raised his hand. "Mrs. Olsen, about our current team." "Everyone will keep their jobs for now," she responded, emphasizing the last words. "But you will be evaluated under new criteria. Technical excellence is no longer enough. Humanity, empathy, and teamwork will be equally important." Rachel felt all eyes turn to her. Her reputation in the restaurant was known to everyone. Efficient, yes, but completely devoid of the qualities the new owner had just mentioned. "In the coming weeks, we will implement new procedures," Helen continued. "Each employee will receive specific development goals. Performance will be monitored daily." The meeting continued with technical and administrative details, but Rachel could barely pay attention. Her mind was stuck on the humiliation of the previous day, on every acid word she had directed at the woman who now controlled her professional destiny. After the meeting, as the employees dispersed to their duties, Helen called Rachel aside. "Miss Sanders, isn't it?" Helen asked, though it was obvious she already knew a lot about her. 15 years with the house, known for efficiency and for other characteristics as well. Rachel swallowed hard but maintained her posture. "Mrs. Olsen, about yesterday." "There's no need to talk about yesterday," Helen gently interrupted her. "The past is important only for what it teaches us. I'm more interested in the future." There was something in Helen's tone of voice that made Rachel feel extremely uncomfortable. It wasn't anger or desire for revenge. It was something deeper, more calculated. "From today on, you will have additional responsibilities," Helen continued. "In addition to your normal duties, you will be responsible for training new employees in customer service." Rachel blinked, confused. "Training?" "Exactly. Who better to teach about the importance of good service than someone who knows so well the impact of poor service?" Helen smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We start tomorrow. And Rachel, I look forward to seeing your evolution." When Rachel finally left the room, her legs were wobbly. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely vulnerable. The restaurant she considered her kingdom now seemed like a strange and hostile territory. Watching from the window of her new office, Helen allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her revenge would not be quick or obvious. It would be a slow and meticulous process of transformation. Rachel would learn her lesson, but not in the way she expected. The day continued with employees adapting to the new reality. Meanwhile, Rachel remained at her post, mechanically serving customers, her usual arrogance replaced by a silent apprehension. The shadow of what was to come loomed over her like a storm cloud, promising changes that even she could not predict. First week under new management transformed Flavor and Flair into an unrecognizable environment for Rachel. The changes began subtly: new uniforms, redesigned menus, and an evaluation system that allowed customers to comment on every aspect of the service. "Good morning, team," Helen announced during the morning meeting. "Today we begin our service excellence program. Rachel, please come to the front." Rachel walked to the front of the room, feeling the weight of her colleagues' gazes. Her posture, once naturally haughty, now seemed forced, like armor beginning to crack. "Rachel will be our service instructor," Helen explained, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "She will demonstrate different scenarios of customer interaction, and we will all learn together what to do and what not to do." A blush tinged Rachel's face as she understood what was coming. Helen had prepared a series of test situations in which Rachel would have to demonstrate correct service, precisely in the situations where she used to be most acidic. "First scenario," Helen began, consulting her notes. "A customer asks for changes to a menu item due to dietary restrictions. How should we proceed, Rachel?" Rachel took a deep breath, aware of the irony of the situation. "We should listen carefully to the request and check with the kitchen for adaptation possibilities," she responded mechanically. "Excellent theory," Helen smiled. "Let's practice. Melissa, you'll be the customer." For the next hour, Rachel was forced to act out situations that were painfully familiar, but now from the opposite side. Each scenario seemed specifically chosen to highlight her most problematic behaviors from the past. Meanwhile, bigger changes were happening behind the scenes. Helen introduced a new management system, and old documents began to be reviewed. Edward, the manager, spent hours in closed meetings with the new owner. During lunch, Rachel found refuge in the employee break area when she was surprised by a conversation. "You won't believe what I found out," Melissa whispered to Paula, not noticing Rachel's presence. "Mrs. Olsen worked here 20 years ago." Rachel froze behind the half-open door, her ears attentive to every word. "What do you mean?" Paula asked, equally surprised. "According to old Joe from maintenance, she was a waitress here just like us, but she left suddenly. Nobody really knows why." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about this story that deeply disturbed her, as if an important piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activities. Rachel alternated between her normal duties and the training sessions, each moment a trial. Customers, noticing the change in her demeanor, reacted with surprise, some even with a certain pleasure in seeing her restrained. At the end of the workday, when the last customer had left, Helen called Rachel to her office again. "How did you feel today, Rachel?" she asked, indicating a chair. "It was different," Rachel responded, choosing her words carefully. "You know, Rachel, sometimes we need to experience the other side of the coin to truly understand the impact of our actions," Helen commented, leafing through an old folder. "Do you consider yourself an observant person?" Rachel nodded, confused by the direction of the conversation. "Then perhaps you've noticed that I'm reviewing old records of the restaurant," Helen continued. "I found fascinating things, stories of people who passed through here, lives that were transformed, for better and for worse." Helen's tone carried a weight that made Rachel shift uncomfortably in her chair. "Tomorrow we begin a new phase of changes," Helen announced. "You will be responsible for a special project. I want you to document all the complaints we've received in the last 5 years, every single one of them." Rachel paled. 5 years of complaints meant 5 years of her worst moments recorded in detail. "And Rachel," Helen added, as she was already getting up to leave, "pay close attention to the names. Sometimes the past has an interesting way of connecting with the present." That night, Rachel could barely sleep. Her mind was buzzing with the day's discoveries and apprehension for what was to come. In her silent apartment, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to question whether the kingdom she had built was, in fact, just a house of cards about to collapse. The special project assigned by Helen proved more challenging than Rachel could have imagined. Installed in a small room at the back of the restaurant, she dove into box after box of old records. Each complaint she read was like a mirror reflecting her own actions. Extremely rude waitress, disrespectful treatment, inappropriate comments about personal choices. The words danced before her eyes, forming a mosaic of behaviors that now made her feel growing discomfort. "How's the progress?" Helen's voice surprised her, making her jump slightly in her chair. "I've reviewed the last 2 years," Rachel responded, trying to maintain her composure. "It's quite a lot of material." Helen approached, picking up one of the complaint forms. "Ah, this one is interesting," she commented, her eyes scanning the document. "Do you remember this specific situation? An elderly lady who wanted her soup less hot." Rachel swallowed hard. She remembered perfectly. She had made a sarcastic comment about adult diapers that circulated as a joke among the staff for weeks. "So, Rachel," Helen continued, sitting on the edge of the desk, "each person who walks through that door carries a story. Some are visible, others not so much, but all deserve respect." As she spoke, Helen opened a different folder, older and yellowed by time. For example, this complaint from 20 years ago. A young waitress was publicly humiliated for her weight. The comments were so cruel that she not only abandoned the job, but her dreams of management. Rachel felt her heart race. The story sounded strangely familiar, and the dates coincided with what she had heard about Helen's past. "What happened to her?" Rachel asked, her voice almost a whisper. "She turned humiliation into fuel," Helen answered, a determined gleam in her eyes. "She studied, worked, built an empire in the food industry, and she promised herself that one day she would return to ensure that no one else went through what she had experienced." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel felt the weight of every word, of every look exchanged with Helen. The revelation hung in the air not as a threat, but as a living lesson about the consequences of thoughtless actions. At that moment, they were interrupted by Edward, who hurriedly entered the room. "Mrs. Olsen, we need you in the kitchen. The new chef is having problems with the team." Helen rose calmly. "Continue your work, Rachel. Oh, and don't forget to check especially the complaints from last month. I believe you'll find something revealing." Rachel spent the following hours immersed in the records, but her mind kept returning to Helen's story. Each new complaint she read now carried a different weight, a human dimension that she had chosen to ignore before. During the lunch rush, Rachel observed the restaurant's movement with new eyes. She saw Melissa patiently helping an indecisive customer, Paula genuinely smiling as she served a family with young children, Edward gracefully resolving a problem. "Rachel?" a timid voice called her. It was Anna, the new waitress who had started the week before. "Yes," she responded, surprising herself with the softness in her own voice. "There's a customer at table 15 who specifically asked for you. He said you served him a few months ago." Rachel headed to the indicated table, her stomach churning as she recognized the face of the customer, an elderly gentleman whom she had treated with particular disdain due to his specific requests about coffee preparation. "Miss Rachel," he smiled to her surprise, "I came especially today because I heard about the changes in the restaurant. I wanted to see if you were still here." Confused by the unexpected kindness, Rachel braced herself for what would certainly be a formal complaint about her past behavior. "You know," he continued, "after that day I reflected a lot on how people sometimes hide their own pain behind masks of harshness. I came to bring you this." He extended a small envelope. Inside there was a thank you card and an old photo, a young, smiling waitress clearly happy in her work. "I found this photo among my late wife's belongings. She worked here many years ago and always said that a sincere smile could transform someone's day." Rachel held the card with trembling hands, feeling for the first time in years the real weight of her choices and attitudes. The kingdom she had built was beginning to reveal itself as a prison, one that she herself had built brick by brick with her arrogance and indifference. The days that followed brought a silent but profound transformation to flavor and flair. Rachel, once the undisputed queen of the dining room, now moved with an almost palpable caution. Her eyes, once sharp and ready to judge, now observed the environment with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. On a particularly busy morning, Helen gathered the entire team before the restaurant opened. "Today, we will begin a new phase in our transformation journey," she announced, her gaze scanning each face present. "We will implement what I call Inversion Day." A murmur of confusion ran through the group. Rachel felt her stomach sink, anticipating that she wouldn't like what was coming next. "Each of you will assume a role different from your usual one," Helen explained. "Cooks will serve tables, waiters will work in the kitchen, and our administrative team will help with cleaning and organization." Eyes instinctively turned to Rachel, all anticipating her reaction. To everyone's surprise, she remained silent, just nodding slightly. "Rachel," Helen called, an enigmatic gleam in her eyes, "you will spend the day in the kitchen, assisting our prep team." The shock was visible on Rachel's face, but she restrained herself. "Understood," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. As the day progressed, the restaurant transformed into an almost comical scene of errors and successes. Edward, always so composed in his suit, now ran between tables balancing plates. Melissa, an expert in customer service, struggled with pots and seasonings in the kitchen. Rachel, meanwhile, faced her own battle behind the scenes. Her hands, accustomed to carrying trays with elegance, now trembled as she chopped vegetables. Each shouted order from the chef made her jump. Each mistake made was a stab to her pride. "Rachel, we need more sauce for table 7, shouted the chef, his voice echoing through the frantic kitchen. She moved quickly, determined not to fail, but in her haste, she bumped into an assistant, dropping a tray of clean plates. The crash seemed to freeze time for an instant. Rachel stood paralyzed, expecting the explosion of anger that would certainly come, the same one she would have had if someone had committed such an error in her domain. But what followed surprised her. "It's okay, it happens," said the chef, already bending down to help clean up. "Come on, team, let's get to work. We have customers waiting." The unexpected kindness touched Rachel in a way she didn't expect. For the first time, she felt the true weight of her own past arrogance. From the other side of the kitchen door, Helen discreetly observed. Her plan was working better than she could have imagined. The transformation wasn't just Rachel's, but of the entire restaurant environment. At the end of the day, exhausted and humbled, Rachel found Helen in her office. How was your experience? Helen asked, indicating a chair. Rachel hesitated, searching for the right words. It was enlightening, she finally answered. I never imagined how challenging it is to be on the other side. Helen gently completed. Rachel nodded, feeling unexpected tears form in her eyes. How do you do it? She suddenly asked. How do you not hold a grudge after everything you went through here? Helen smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Grudges are too heavy a burden to carry, Rachel. I learned that true strength lies in using our experiences to create positive changes. That night, as she closed the restaurant, Rachel looked at the empty dining room with new eyes. The kingdom she had so prized now seemed different, not a battlefield, but a space of possibilities and growth. The morning began with a heavy sky, foreshadowing a storm that was forming not only on the horizon, but also within flavor and flair. Rachel arrived earlier than usual, determined to prove her worth under the new circumstances. As she entered, she immediately noticed the tension in the air. Helen was in a heated conversation with Edward near the reception, their faces marked with concern. Good morning, Rachel approached cautiously. Is everything okay? Helen turned, surprised by the genuine concern in Rachel's voice. Good morning, Rachel. We have a delicate situation on our hands. Edward cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. The audits revealed some discrepancies in the financial records of recent years. Rachel felt her heart race. Although she wasn't directly responsible for finances, she knew that her informal leadership position in the restaurant put her under scrutiny. What kind of discrepancies? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Helen sighed deeply. It seems there has been a systematic diversion of funds. They're not astronomical amounts, but enough to seriously compromise our current situation. The revelation fell like lightning on Rachel. Flashes of whispered conversations, quickly hidden documents, and strange behaviors from former managers flooded her mind. I didn't know, she stammered, suddenly feeling vulnerable. We're not accusing anyone, Rachel, Helen assured. But we need everyone's cooperation to unravel this. Every piece of information, every detail can be crucial. At that moment, the doors opened and the rest of the team began to arrive. Helen asked everyone to gather in the conference room. The air was heavy with apprehension as she explained the situation. From today on, each of you will be interviewed individually, Helen announced. It's not a witch hunt, but an attempt to reconstruct the puzzle of what happened here in recent years. Rachel observed her colleagues' reactions. Some seemed genuinely shocked, others nervous, and some guilty. She found herself analyzing each expression, each movement, with a new critical eye. Throughout the day, the restaurant functioned in a state of forced normality. Customers were served with tense smiles, and the kitchen operated in an unusual silence. Rachel, divided between her usual duties and anxiety about the situation, found herself lost in thought several times. Rachel, Melissa's voice brought her back to reality. Do you have a moment? The two moved to a more private corner of the dining room. I need to tell you something, Melissa began, her voice trembling slightly. A few months ago, I saw something strange. The former financial manager, the one who left suddenly, he was messing with some files after hours. Rachel felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief for not being directly involved, guilt for not having noticed anything suspicious happening right under her nose. Did you tell anyone about this? She asked. Melissa shook her head. I was afraid. You know how things were before, and who dared to question anything? The irony of the situation didn't escape Rachel. Her own tyrannical behavior had created an environment where irregularities could flourish without question. At the end of the day, physically and emotionally exhausted, Rachel was called to Helen's office for her interview. Rachel, Helen began, her tone surprisingly gentle, before we officially start, I want you to know that I believe in your integrity. The words caught Rachel by surprise. Unexpected tears welled up in her eyes. I failed, she admitted, her voice choked. Not with dishonesty, but with negligence. I was so focused on maintaining my control that I didn't see what was happening around me. Helen nodded understandingly. Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our most painful mistakes. What's important is what we do from here on out. As the storm raged outside, inside Helen's office, Rachel felt like she was in the eye of the hurricane. There, facing her mistakes and weaknesses, she began to glimpse a path to redemption, not just personal, but for all of Flavor and Flair. As night fell, the silent restaurant seemed to reflect the transformation in progress. The shadows of the past still lingered, but now mixed with the promise of a new dawn. Rachel, looking out the window at the falling rain, felt for the first time in years that she was ready to face whatever came, not as a queen on her throne, but as part of a team united by adversity and hope. In the weeks that followed the revelation of financial irregularities, Flavor and Flair transformed into a cauldron of emotions and changes. The internal investigation, led by Helen and a team of external auditors, progressed slowly, revealing layers of mismanagement and questionable decisions that spanned years. Rachel, now fully aware of her indirect responsibility in the situation, dove headfirst into the reconstruction process. Her mornings began before sunrise, reviewing reports and procedures. Her nights ended late, after long planning meetings with Helen and the team. "We need to completely rethink our structure," Helen announced during one of these meetings, "not just financially, but in terms of organizational culture." Rachel, sitting next to Edward and other key team members, nodded vigorously. "I have some ideas," she began, surprising everyone with her enthusiasm. "What if we implemented a 360-degree feedback system, where everyone can evaluate and be evaluated, including management?" The silence that followed was broken by Helen's approving smile. "Excellent suggestion, Rachel. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." In the days that followed, the restaurant became a laboratory of new ideas and practices. Walls were torn down, literally and figuratively, to create a more open and collaborative environment. The kitchen, once an isolated kingdom, now had a viewing area where customers could observe the preparation of dishes. Rachel, once the untouchable queen of the dining room, could now be seen in all areas of the restaurant. She helped in the kitchen, waited tables, and even assisted with cleaning at the end of the shift. Her transformation did not go unnoticed by the team. "You're different," Melissa commented one day as the two organized inventory. "More approachable." Rachel paused, reflecting on the observation. "I think I finally understood what it means to be part of a team," she responded with a shy smile. As the changes solidified, customers began to notice. The atmosphere at Flavor and Flair was lighter, more welcoming. Online reviews, once a nightmare of negative comments, began to consistently improve. One day, during the lunch rush, a familiar face entered the restaurant. It was the gentleman who had brought the old photo to Rachel. She greeted him with a genuine smile. "What a wonderful change," he exclaimed, looking around. "The place is unrecognizable, and so are you, my dear." Rachel felt a warmth in her chest upon hearing these words. "Thank you, sir. We're all working hard to improve." As she served him, Rachel noticed Helen observing the scene from afar, a look of approval on her face. At the end of that night, after the last customer had left, Helen gathered the entire team. "I want to thank everyone for the incredible effort of the past few weeks," she began. "Especially you, Rachel. Your dedication and willingness to change have been fundamental to our progress." Rachel felt everyone's eyes on her, but this time it wasn't a look of fear or resentment. It was one of respect and perhaps even admiration. "Thank you, Helen," she responded, her voice choked with emotion. "But this is a team effort. Each person here has been essential to this transformation." At that moment, looking at the smiling and determined faces of her colleagues, Rachel truly understood the meaning of leadership. It wasn't about control or fear, but about inspiring and elevating those around her. As the group dispersed, Rachel stayed behind, observing the empty dining room. Flavor and Flair was no longer just a restaurant. It was a symbol of renewal and second chances. And she, Rachel Sanders, was no longer a lonely queen on her throne, but an integral part of something much larger and more meaningful. The dawn brought with it not just a new day, but also an unexpected challenge for flavor and flair. Rachel arrived, early as had become her habit, only to find Helen and Edward in a tense conversation near the entrance. "What happened?" Rachel asked, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere. Helen sighed deeply before responding. "We just discovered that a new restaurant is about to open across the street. And it's not just any restaurant, it's a franchise of a famous chain." The news fell like a bomb. Flavor and Flair, still recovering from its own internal turbulence, would now face direct and powerful competition. But how didn't we know about this before? Rachel questioned, her mind already calculating the possible impacts. "They kept the project secret," Edward explained, "probably to avoid any local opposition." Helen gathered the entire team to share the news. The initial shock gave way to a mixture of fear and determination. "I won't lie," Helen began, her voice firm. "This represents a great challenge for us, but it's also an opportunity to prove what we're capable of." Rachel, surprising herself, was the first to speak up. "We have something they don't: history, tradition, and a real connection with our community." Her words seemed to ignite a spark of hope in the group. In the days that followed, Flavor and Flair transformed into a whirlwind of activity and creativity. Rachel led an initiative to reconnect with loyal old customers. She spent hours on the phone, sending personalized invitations for a special rediscovery event at the restaurant. Melissa and the service team immersed themselves in intensive training, further honing their hospitality skills. Edward worked tirelessly on the numbers, seeking ways to optimize costs without compromising quality. In the kitchen, a revolution was underway. The chef, inspired by the challenge, created a new menu that blended customers' classic favorites with bold innovations. Rachel, in her free moments, joined the kitchen team, learning and contributing ideas. A week before the inauguration of the new competitor, Flavor and Flair held its rediscovery event. The restaurant was unrecognizable, decorated with old photos that told its story, tables arranged to create an intimate and welcoming atmosphere. Rachel, dressed in an elegant but simple uniform, moved among the guests with a grace that surprised even herself. She shared stories, listened to feedback, and most importantly, genuinely connected with each person. At one point in the evening, she found herself talking to a group of old customers, including the gentleman with the photo. "You know," he commented, his eyes shining with emotion, "this place has always been special. But now it seems to have found its soul again." Rachel felt tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you," she responded softly. "We're all rediscovering the true meaning of this place." From across the room, Helen observed the scene with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Her initial plan for revenge had transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. As the night progressed, it became clear that the event was a resounding success. Social media was filled with photos and positive comments, the hashtag Flavor and Flair Reborn trending locally. When the last guest departed, the team gathered in the center of the dining room, exhausted but exultant. "You were incredible," Helen declared, her voice heavy with emotion. This is what it means to be a true family." Rachel, standing beside her colleagues, her family, felt a wave of accomplishment she had never experienced before. The challenge that awaited them was still immense, but now she knew she wouldn't face it alone. As the team dispersed, Rachel remained in the dining room for a moment longer. Looking around at the empty tables and soft lights, she no longer saw a kingdom to be conquered, but a home to be nurtured and protected. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Flavor and Flair, and Rachel along with it, was ready to face any storm that came, not as an impenetrable fortress, but as a beacon of resilience, community, and transformation. The day of the new competing restaurant's grand opening arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension in the air. Across the street, a line was forming in front of the gleaming establishment, with its modern facade and eye-catching signs. Rachel watched from the window of Flavor and Flair, her heart tight but determined. "We're ready for this," Helen said, placing a comforting hand on Rachel's shoulder. Remember, we're not just competing with prices or menus. We're offering an experience, a story. Rachel nodded, turning to face the assembled team. Her eyes scanned each face: Melissa, Edward, Chef Paul, the young kitchen assistants. Each of them was a fundamental part of this new story they were writing together. Everyone, Rachel began, her voice firm. Today isn't about them, it's about us, about who we've become and what we represent to our community. Let's show everyone the true flavor of dedication and care. Rachel's words seemed to energize the team. Everyone took their positions with a determined gleam in their eyes. The door opened, and the first customer of the day entered. The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The flow at Flavor and Flair fluctuated, moments of unsettling calm followed by peaks of excitement. Rachel moved through the dining room like never before, attending tables, supporting the team, ensuring every detail was perfect. In the middle of the afternoon, a group of customers entered, clearly coming from the competing restaurant. Rachel greeted them with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Flavor and Flair. How can I help you?" "We were curious," replied a lady. "We've heard so much about the changes here. We wanted to see for ourselves." Rachel guided them to a table, sharing stories about the restaurant while presenting the menu. Her passion was contagious, and soon the group was immersed in the experience, completely forgetting about the other establishment. As night fell, the flow of customers increased. Many were familiar faces, old customers returning, attracted by Rachel's reconnection campaign. Others were new, curious to compare the two dining options on the street. At a particularly busy moment, Rachel noticed Helen talking to a man in a suit at the restaurant's entrance. Their serious looks and quick exchange of business cards indicated it wasn't a casual conversation. Hours later, with the last satisfied customer leaving the establishment, the team gathered for a recap of the day. They were exhausted, but a sense of accomplishment hung in the air. "You were exceptional," Helen declared, pride evident in her voice, "but our journey is just beginning. Rachel, can I speak with you privately?" The two headed to the office, leaving the curious team behind. "The man I was talking to earlier," Helen began, "was a representative from the competing chain." Rachel felt her heart race. What did he want? To make an offer, Helen replied, her expression enigmatic. "They want to buy Flavor and Flair." The shock left Rachel momentarily speechless. All the work, all the transformation they had gone through, to end like this? "And what did you say?" Rachel finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen smiled, a determined gleam in her eyes. "I said I would need to consult my partner before making any decision." Rachel blinked, confused. "Partner?" "Yes, Rachel," Helen answered, extending a folder. "If you accept, of course. This restaurant isn't just a business for me, it's a legacy, and I can't think of anyone better to share it with than you." Rachel opened the folder with trembling hands, seeing the documents that would make her co-owner of Flavor and Flair. Tears began to form in her eyes, but this time they were of pure joy and gratitude. "Helen, I don't know what to say." "Say, you're ready for the next chapter of this story," Helen replied, extending her hand. "Because believe me, our true test of fire is just beginning." Rachel looked at the outstretched hand, then at the documents, and finally back at Helen's smiling face. At that moment, she saw reflected not only her own growth, but the bright future they could build together. With a determined smile, Rachel shook Helen's hand. "I'm more than ready. Let's show everyone the true flavor of success." The months that followed Rachel's partnership offer were a roller coaster of emotions and challenges for her and the entire Flavor and Flair team. The news that the restaurant had refused the buyout offer from the competing chain spread quickly, generating a wave of support from the local community. Rachel, now co-owner, dove headfirst into her new responsibilities. Her days began before sunrise, reviewing spreadsheets and planning strategies. Her nights ended late, after long conversations with Helen about the future of the business. "We need to think beyond these four walls," Rachel suggested during one of these meetings. What if we expanded our presence in the community? Helen smiled, clearly impressed. What do you have in mind? Thus was born the Flavor of Community project. Flavor and Flair began offering free cooking classes to low-income youth using the restaurant space during off hours. Rachel led the initiative, finding a new passion in teaching and mentoring. The impact was immediate and profound. Stories of the young apprentices began to circulate, attracting local media attention. Flavor and Flair was no longer just a restaurant. It was becoming a pillar of the community. Meanwhile, competition with the chain restaurant remained fierce. But where there was once fear, there was now determination. Each challenge was seen as an opportunity for growth and innovation. One day during a Flavor of Community class, Rachel noticed a familiar face among the observers. It was the representative from the competing chain who had made the buyout offer months ago. "Impressive what you've done here," he commented, approaching Rachel after the class. "I must admit, we underestimated the power of community connection." Rachel smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and gratitude. Sometimes, true success isn't in the numbers, but in the lives we touch. Rachel's words seemed to resonate with the man. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. The competing restaurant, inspired by Flavor and Flair's example, began implementing its own community initiatives. What was once fierce competition transformed into an unexpected collaboration for the good of the community. On a sunny Sunday morning, exactly 1 year after Helen's arrival and the beginning of the transformation, Flavor and Flair was unrecognizable, not just physically, but in spirit. The tables were occupied by a diverse mix of customers, families who had frequented the place for generations, young people attracted by the new initiatives, even employees from the competing restaurant, who now saw Flavor and Flair not as an enemy, but as an inspiration. Rachel, standing at the entrance to the dining room, observed the scene with misty eyes. Melissa approached, putting an arm around her now friend and mentor. "Who would have thought, huh?" Melissa commented with a smile. "From Ice Queen to the heart of Flavor and Flair." Rachel laughed, hugging Melissa back. The transformation wasn't just mine, it was all of us. Helen joined them, her eyes shining with pride and emotion. "You know what impresses me the most?" she asked. "It's not the financial success, although that's remarkable. It's seeing how each person here has grown, how we've become a true family." The three women observed the dining room full of life, each table telling a story of transformation and connection. The delicious aroma coming from the kitchen mingled with the sound of laughter and lively conversations, creating a symphony of community and belonging. Rachel took a deep breath, feeling a peace she never imagined possible. Flavor and Flair was no longer just a restaurant or a business. It was a living testament that change is possible, that second chances exist, and that true success lies in elevating those around us. As the sun set, casting a golden glow through the restaurant windows, Rachel knew with certainty this wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a new and exciting chapter. Flavor and Flair, like herself, had been reborn, stronger and more beautiful than ever. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and eyes fixed on a bright future, Rachel embraced her new reality. She was no longer the lonely queen of a crumbling kingdom, but an integral part of a vibrant and loving community. The true flavor of life, she discovered, was in the shared journey, in challenges overcome together, and in the transformative power of love and understanding. Flavor and Flair would continue to evolve, face new challenges, and celebrate new victories. But one thing was certain: whatever the future held, they would face it united as a family, serving not just meals, but also hope, inspiration, and the sweet taste of transformation.